we're going to be talking about the different roles of the lawyer. So this subsection of the rules makes up 4 to 10% of your total MPRE examination. The first rule that I'd like to direct your attention to is lawyer as an advisor. So here the rule says that in representing a client, a lawyer shall exercise independent professional judgment and render candid advice, even if it's not what the client wants to hear. In rendering advice, a lawyer may refer not only to law, but other considerations such as moral, economic, social, or any political factors that may be relevant to the client's situation. So turning to your example found in your outline on this point, it says that a client comes to a lawyer because he wants the lawyer's opinion regarding a business transaction. The lawyer thinks, based upon his expertise in the field, that it's a bad idea to enter into this transaction. The lawyer must tell the client what he believes. So to stop here, the idea behind this rule is that sometimes us as lawyers are being used to give our clients an opinion. And it might not just be an opinion based upon, the law or our understanding of the law, but instead it could be because we know our client's business. We know who their clients are. We know and understand the social and political pressures maybe that are going on at that time or around their business or around a transaction. So when someone comes to us as an advisor, it's our obligation to give them our candid advice, even if it's the type of thing your client might not want to hear. Turning to our role as an evaluator. So lawyers as evaluators. So the rules here tell us that a lawyer may provide an evaluation of a matter affecting a client for the use of someone other than the client, if the lawyer reasonably believes that the making of the evaluation is compatible with other aspects of the lawyer's relationship with the client. So a lot of people have had questions and asked me directly about what this rule means, and I think the example in the outline that we've provided is spot on. So turning there first, it says that such an evaluation may be for the primary purpose of establishing information for the benefit of a third party. So let's say, for instance, an opinion concerning the title of property, rendered at the request of a vendor for the information of a prospective buyer. So let's expand on this. Maybe you have a client that has a pretty large investment portfolio that contains a lot of real property. And maybe this client is looking to sell some of those pieces of property. So in an effort for you to help facilitate this transaction, you need to get the land evaluated. You can maybe help us figure out how much it's worth, for instance. Or maybe a prospective purchaser approaches you and says that their client is interested in buying the land, but they want it evaluated to understand its true title and value. So your job here, lawyer as an evaluator, could be to help and to facilitate those types of evaluations. Now, to continue on, the rule tells us that when the lawyer knows or reasonably should know that the evaluation is likely to affect the client's interests materially and adversely, the lawyer shall not provide the evaluation unless the client gives informed consent. And before I give you an example on that point, look at the next point about this rule. It says, except as disclosure is authorized in connection with a report of an evaluation, information relating to the evaluation is otherwise protected by the confidentiality rules. So remember how we define, our duty of confidentiality. It pertains to information that we learn about our client and about the representation throughout the representation of that client. And anything that falls into that category is protected by our duty of confidentiality. So if you undertake to have an evaluation done, let's say of your client's real estate, that by all means will be protected or covered by this duty of confidentiality. So I think that makes sense because it's information that you're learning throughout the representation of your client that pertains to that representation. So to circle back up to the point that I said we'd come back to, it's this idea that if you have, say, an evaluation done of your client's asset, maybe a piece of real property, and it doesn't come back very good, you shouldn't just hand it off to someone, like a prospective purchaser, for instance, without first getting your client's informed consent. So let's say you have a piece of property evaluated, and unfortunately for your client, it comes back that maybe there's toxic waste on the piece of property, and it's very problematic, and your client can't sell it now because not only is it worthless, but your client might have to pay to have the piece of property cleaned up properly. So in an instance like this, you would definitely want to give this information to your client and let him or her direct you about how to move forward. And that's because this evaluation is confidential. It falls under this duty of confidentiality, and you most definitely would not hand that over without getting your client's informed consent first. The next rule that I would like to discuss with respect to this subsection is about prosecutors and other government lawyers. So first, let's talk about the rationale with these rules that we're about to focus on for a second, and then we'll dive back deeper into the rules. And this rationale comes from the comments of the ABA model rules. So it tells us that our prosecutors have the responsibility of a minister of justice, and not simply that as an advocate. This responsibility carries with it specific obligations to see that the defendant is accorded procedural justice, that guilt is decided upon the basis of sufficient evidence, and that special precautions are taken to prevent and to rectify the conviction of innocent persons. So I take this to mean that we have added additional ethical burdens upon our prosecutors and other governmental lawyers. So the way I like to think of this, and maybe it's silly, but it helps me better frame these rules, is as follows. I like to think of us regular lawyers down here, kind of like a lower rung of the ladder. We have ethical responsibilities, of course, but we're kind of at the basics, like the bare bones. And above us, people with more responsibility would be prosecutors or other governmental lawyers. And above them would be judges. They have even a heightened expectation and ethical requirements to comply with. So hopefully that helps frame the rules that we're about to dive deeper into. So the first rule that I want to talk about says the prosecutor in a criminal case shall refrain from prosecuting a charge that the prosecutor knows is not supported by probable cause. So if you've studied, the Fourth Amendment, for instance, or maybe taken a criminal procedure class, you know that probable cause is the backbone, really, of so much of our criminal prosecutions, generally speaking. And here, this ethical requirement here on prosecutors is just kind of reflecting back on that basic point. Prosecutors should not be violating anyone's rights, let alone a criminal defendants. So if there's not probable cause to move forward with the charge, they simply shouldn't be moving forward with the charge. So I want to give you one more quick example so that you can make sure you're reading these fact patterns carefully. Let's say a lawyer's a prosecutor in a case where a defendant's been charged with murder. And the prosecutor knows that there is probable cause to move forward with this prosecution, but the prosecutor doesn't believe that the jury is actually going to find that this defendant committed murder beyond a reasonable doubt. And the prosecutor decides to move forward with the charge anyways. Has the prosecutor done anything wrong? Have they violated this ethical responsibility? And the answer is no. As long as that prosecutor has probable cause to move forward with that prosecution or charge, that's all that's required. Even if they don't think they have enough evidence to convince that jury beyond a reasonable doubt, that's okay. That's not what this rule requires. The rule simply requires probable cause to move forward with the charge. So getting back to the rule, it says that prosecutors in a criminal case shall make reasonable efforts to assure that the accused has been advised of their right to obtain counsel, the procedure for obtaining counsel, and has been given a reasonable opportunity to get counsel. Because again, this is their right, and these lawyers here as governmental attorneys or prosecutors should not be violating their basic rights. Similarly, they should not seek to obtain from an unrepresented person a waiver of important pretrial rights, such as the right to a preliminary hearing. So if you have a criminal defendant that doesn't have a lawyer yet for whatever reason, or doesn't have one at all if they're unrepresented, you as a prosecutor should not seek to use this as an advantage. Don't get them to waive important rights. The next rule many people know as the Brady Rule if they've taken a criminal prosecution class. But it's also this ethical responsibility upon prosecutors. So the rule says, prosecutors in a criminal case shall make timely disclosure to the defense of all evidence or information known to the prosecutor that tends to negate the guilt of the accused or to mitigate the offense. And in connection with sentencing, disclose to the defense and to the tribunal all unprivileged mitigating information known to the prosecutor, except where the prosecutor is relieved of this responsibility by a protective order of the court. The idea here is, remember, prosecutors shouldn't be violating anyone's rights, let alone a criminally accused or criminal defendants. So if a prosecutor comes across evidence that helps the defendant, they should be handing it over to the defendant. They shouldn't be keeping it or hiding it from the defendant. So look at the example in your outline. It says if a prosecutor discovers a witness that says the defendant was acting in self-defense when he shot the victim, the prosecutor must disclose this witness to the defense. Again, that's helpful evidence to the defendant or mitigating evidence to the defendant. So the prosecutor has this ethical responsibility to hand it over. The next rule that I want to talk about still talks about prosecutors. And I get a lot of questions on this, and it makes a great multiple choice question. So I think it's worth discussing, and then I have a quick example for you on the point. So the rule says that when a prosecutor knows of new, credible, and material evidence creating a reasonable likelihood that a convicted defendant did not commit an offense of which the defendant was convicted, the prosecutor shall, 1, promptly disclose that evidence to the appropriate court or the appropriate authority. And if this conviction was obtained in the prosecutor's jurisdiction, they must promptly disclose this evidence to the defendant unless the court has authorized delay for some reason, and undertake further investigation or make reasonable efforts to cause an investigation in order to determine whether the defendant was convicted of an offense that they did not commit. So let's stop there. So if you're a prosecutor and somehow, some way, you're investigating a case and you come across new, credible evidence that creates this reasonable likelihood that someone is sitting in jail for a crime they didn't commit. But in Florida, you're a prosecutor in New York, let's say, and this evidence tends to show that there's someone sitting in a Florida prison for a crime they didn't commit. What do? Well, the first part of this rule says that you need to hand over that evidence to the appropriate court or to the appropriate authority. So you would give that information to, whatever jurisdiction is applicable in Florida. But the rule doesn't stop there. What happens if this information you come across is applicable to your jurisdiction? Well, in that instance, if it's your backyard, you have an even greater burden to act as a prosecutor. So if you come across this type of evidence for something that happened in your jurisdiction, now you need to give it to that defendant, whoever it is, assuming the court hasn't told you to stop or delay for some reason. And again, you're not done. You have to now take steps to undertake an investigation to get to the bottom of whether or not this person is sitting in prison for a crime they didn't commit, or make sure someone else is investigating to kind of get to the bottom of that issue as well. So to give you a quick example of this, not in your outline, but I think it just helps kind of flesh this out a little bit more. Let's say a prosecutor successfully convicted a man of first-degree murder, and it was a very high-profile murder case. And the man, was convicted and is now sitting in prison. This lawyer, the prosecutor, is still a prosecutor in this jurisdiction and still doing his job. And he comes across evidence that if it's in fact true, it's DNA evidence, it would exonerate this man who's been convicted of first-degree murder, currently sitting in prison, and has been for the last 5 years. What is the prosecutor's obligation when they get this evidence? Well, this rule speaks directly to that situation because this is new, credible evidence, according to the rule, that creates that reasonable likelihood that this defendant is sitting in prison for a crime they didn't commit. And more specifically, I told you it's in the prosecutor's jurisdiction. So they need to give this evidence to that specific defendant. And then they need to undertake an investigation or cause an investigation to begin to get to the bottom of that scenario. Still on that point, but just slightly different, the rules tell us that when a prosecutor knows of clear and convincing evidence establishing that a defendant in their jurisdiction was convicted of an offense that they didn't commit, the prosecutor shall seek to remedy the conviction. So what I want to stress about this rule is the language of it. This rule says that the prosecutor has clear and convincing evidence. So if you're a prosecutor and let's say you get a confession, you get someone who turns themselves in saying they committed a crime, and there's matching DNA evidence to support that confession, let's say, for a crime that you've already convicted someone of in your jurisdiction, and that defendant's sitting in jail serving time for that crime they didn't commit. And now in front of you, you have that clear and convincing evidence that shows you that that person serving time didn't commit the crime. you need to take action to remedy that conviction. You need to take steps to get them out of prison and to get this person in prison for that crime. So we're still talking about the different roles of the lawyer, but we're going to switch gears just a little bit. I want to talk about a lawyer representing an entity or other organization. And I think this portion of the rules gets challenging for some, and I think that's fair, because corporations or organizations or entities aren't people. When you represent Bob, a person, you know who your client is. That's rather straightforward. But when you represent, say, an entity like a corporation or an organization, this gets more challenging because these organizations, for instance, or corporations are not people, but rather they're ran by people. So it can get more challenging to determine who specifically is the client and who can you talk to? Who do you report to? What happens if someone's doing something wrong? What are your obligations? So this is definitely something that's not as straightforward as when you're representing a person and you know who that person is as your client. So let's talk about our duties as representing an entity or an organization. First things first, these rules tell us that our duty of loyalty runs to the organization itself, not to the people who run it or its constituents. So to be clear, if you're representing a corporation, let's say, and there's, of course, shareholders and officers and boards of directors within that corporation, your duty runs to the corporation itself, not necessarily the people who run it. The rules go on to tell us that in dealing with these organizations, people like directors, officers, employees, members, shareholders, or other constituents, a lawyer shall explain the identity of the client when the lawyer knows or reasonably should know that the organization's interests are adverse to those of the constituents with whom that lawyer is dealing. So if you're representing a corporation and you come to find out that one of the directors of this corporation has an adverse interest to your client, the corporation, you need to make sure you clarify your position and who your client is to this director. Maybe the director forgot, and they need to be reminded that you aren't their lawyer and you don't have their best interests in mind, but instead you have the corporation's best interests in mind. And maybe you need to tell that person to go get their own lawyer. So turning to the first example found in your outline, I think it's very helpful on this point. It says a business manager admitted to general counsel that he had used threats of violence and defamation in order to help maximize the profits of the organization. The general counsel should remind the business manager that he represents the corporation and not the manager, and that threatening people is illegal, and that the business manager might need independent representation. So next, I want to discuss a lawyer's obligation to report when they come to find out that maybe there is some sort of violation of law or like a regulation violation, and who they report to more specifically. So the rule tells us that if the lawyer for an organization knows that a person associated with that organization is acting or going to act in a manner that is a violation of a legal obligation to the organization or is a violation of law that reasonably might be imputed upon to that organization and is likely to result in a substantial injury to the organization, then the lawyer shall proceed as is reasonably necessary in the best interests of the organization. So I'm just going to stop there. Generally speaking, let's say you're representing a corporation. If you come to find out that an officer or a director is doing something, maybe they're violating a law, and as a result, it's likely to be imputed onto your client, the corporation, or it's going to result in some sort of substantial injury upon your client, you have an obligation to act. The rule here uses very strong language. It says that you shall proceed as reasonably necessary in the best interest of your client, that corporation or that organization. In other words, it's commanding you to act. But the rule doesn't stop there. It gets more specific. It tells us, unless the lawyer reasonably believes that it is not necessary in the best interest of the organization to do so, the lawyer shall refer the matter to the higher authority in the organization, usually the board of directors, including, and if warranted by the circumstances, the highest authority that can act on behalf of this organization as determined by applicable law. For instance, like an outside board of directors. So this rule says that unless you believe you don't have to, in other words, unless you think it's not in the best interest of your client, this corporation or this organization, you shall meaning must. That's strong language. You shall report up to the highest authority that can take action on behalf of your client. So if you find out an officer is violating the law that's likely to cause this substantial injury upon your client, you shall report up to that highest authority, maybe the board of directors or the outside board of directors that can act on behalf of your client. But the rule doesn't stop there. So now we've learned you must report up. But what about our obligation to report out? Does that ever come about? And here the rule says that if despite your efforts, the highest authority that can act on behalf of the organization insists upon or fails to address in a timely and appropriate manner an action, or if they refuse to act, that this is clearly a violation of law, and the lawyer reasonably believes that the violation is reasonably certain to result in a substantial injury to the organization, then the lawyer may reveal information relating to the representation, whether or not the duty of confidentiality or the rules of confidentiality permit such a disclosure, but only to the extent the lawyer reasonably believes is necessary to prevent this substantial injury to the organization. So this is essentially saying if you find out that something is happening and it's going to result in this substantial injury to your client, the organization, and you report up, let's say, to the board of directors. And let's say the board of directors refuses to act, or they don't take the correct action. Maybe they don't believe anything is wrong. This rule says that if you reasonably believe that this substantial injury is still going to occur to your client as a result of maybe this failure to act, then you have the ability to report out. And you're even allowed to disclose confidential information as is necessary to prevent this substantial injury that might occur to your client or to this organization. However, the rule is careful to say that you should limit whatever you're disclosing to whatever is reasonably necessary to effectuate your goal. In other words, you're not going to reveal all information, just whatever as is necessary to prevent this substantial injury to your client. The other thing I want to point out is that this rule uses the word may. So you don't have to report out. Remember, you must report up or you have to report up, but you don't have to report out. The rule says may. The other thing I want to point out here is the exception. I see many questions on this exception, so it is worth noting. It says that this shall not apply with respect to information relating to a lawyer's representation of an organization to investigate an alleged violation of law or to defend the organization or an officer or an employee or another constituent associated with the organization against a claim arising out of the alleged violation of law. So let's say you represent a software corporation and there are some allegations that maybe one of the officers has engaged in some sort of action that amounts to like an infringement, a patent infringement issue. And they've asked you as their lawyer to investigate the issue, to kind of get to the bottom of it, to see whether or not the officer has in fact committed a patent violation. So you investigate and you find out that yes, the officer unfortunately has broken the law. And you decide to go hand this information over to the local prosecutor. Are you in trouble for doing so? Yes, because you've been hired or you've been directed by this company to help them get to the bottom of those allegations, not to go tell on them, right? They wanted you to report back to them about your findings so that they could take action and try to remedy the situation. But instead you reported out. You just went and told on your client. And you are not allowed to do that. So this is basically just an exception that's bringing to your attention that you want to pay attention to why a lawyer's been hired. If they're hired because they're representing the organization and they come to find out that something bad's happened, then you follow this reporting up and possibly out scenario. But if the lawyer's been hired to investigate internally on behalf of this corporation, they shouldn't be telling on that entity or corporation. And then the final rule that I want to cover in this subsection is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So this act was passed by Congress back in 2002, and it instructs our Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to make rules for security lawyers who discover clients violating federal or state securities laws. So this rule applies to security lawyers, and to clarify what that means, these are lawyers who represent the issuer of a security and who practice before the SEC. So this includes lawyers who transact business with the SEC or communicate with the SEC or give advice on documents that get filed with the SEC. So, pursuant to this act, the rules state that securities lawyers who become aware of credible evidence that their client is materially violating a federal or a state securities law must report it to their client's chief legal officer, CLO, or their chief executive officer, their CEO. This applies if there's credible evidence that a client's personnel has breached a fiduciary duty under state law or federal law, or committed a similar material violation under federal or state law. So to stop here, if you come to find out about credible evidence that your client is violating a federal or state securities law, there's this mandatory reporting requirement. The rule says must, and it's even more specific than that. It tells you who to report to, specifically the CLO or CEO. But it doesn't stop there. It then goes on to tell you that that person you report to, the CLO or the CEO, must then determine whether or not a violation has in fact occurred. In other words, it's putting an ethical responsibility and a legal burden upon them to basically investigate. If a violation has occurred, then an appropriate response to it is required. The CLO must take all reasonable steps to have the client make an appropriate response, for instance, to remedy the situation and to make sure it doesn't happen again. The CLO has to report the results to the securities lawyer. Now, if an appropriate response is not taken, there's an additional requirement on the lawyer. This securities lawyer must report this evidence to the client's board of directors, to an audit committee of the board, or a committee made up of outside directors. And again, this is a mandatory reporting act. So if once you as the lawyer have reported to that CLO and the CLO does nothing, for instance, you don't just stop there and say, oh, well, I did my job. You then report to one of these three entities. And then finally, the securities lawyer may reveal this information to the SEC, and they can do this without the client's consent. Any confidential information can be shared that's reasonably necessary to stop the client from committing a violation that will cause a substantial financial injury to the client or an investor, to rectify the injury if the lawyer's services were used to facilitate that violation, or prevent the client from committing perjury in an SEC matter or any matter within the jurisdiction of any branch of federal government. So this last part of the rule says that you may report out, essentially, and specifically out to the SEC and give up confidential information even without your client's permission if one of these three instances are applicable. So that wraps up our discussion of the different roles of the lawyer.